The actual substance and direction of the neoliberal turn was determined by the form the right wing critique of social democracy as it developed in the 1970s. And this right wing critique, it took a particular form. I like to think of this form as the curse imposed on the Republican Party and on the world by Barry Goldwater, right wing Arizona senator and 1964 Republican presidential candidate. The Curse of Goldwater had several parts. First, and I think worst, came the racism. And the decision by Barry Goldwater, then backed by Richard Nixon in the subsequent generation, and then adopted by, well, pretty much everyone except for Republican Jack Kemp, that the Republican Party was going to clean up and win elections by abandoning its Lincoln roots and catering to voters who thought that the evolving center-left Democratic Party was no longer treating African Americans badly enough. That is, to a great many white Americans, African Americans were unequal to be treated unequally. That was the point, and it was an offense against fairness. To treat African Americans equally, or to wish for African Americans to be treated equally, or to take an America in which African Americans were treated unequally and point to it as evidence that there was discrimination against African Americans. Instead, to a great many white Americans, America was great, and any failure of accomplishment and failure of the achievement of social power and position on the part of African Americans, was their fault. The riposte to this is the critical race theory position. Do not create a society in which African Americans are poor and without social power, and then create a market society that discriminates against those who are poor and without social power, and without social networks, and then claim you're not discriminating against black people, you're just discriminating against those who are not energetic enough to be rich, and who are not outgoing and clued in enough to build their social networks and their social power. But indeed, there was a broader sense. It was not entirely racialized, that many on the right thought that the social democracy was flawed precisely because it treated unequals equally. This was a version of the Polanyian backlash problem. The fact that social democracy appeared to be unfair and unjust because it does not validate rights, and one of those rights, especially on the right, was the right to have maintained appropriate hierarchies that give you a high place in them. So as social democracy treated those who ought to be kept unequal as if they were equals, the moochers and the takers, this rubbed very many people very much the wrong way, especially when those treated equally by social democracy were American blacks. We've noted before University of Chicago professor, future economics Nobel Prize winner George Stigler. Yep, there is still a Stigler Center at the University of Chicago in its economics department. Stigler, writing in 1962, before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act, before affirmative action, about the problem of the Negro. What for Stigler in 1962 was the problem of the Negro? It was, quote, the stream of demonstrations growing in size and insolence approved or at least tolerated by the political, intellectual, and religious leaders of the nation. The problem of the Negro was not that blacks were discriminated against. It was that they were demonstrating and insolent. Why was this a problem? Because it taught a, quote, semi-literate Negro teenager in a slum that evil prejudice of the white man was the fundamental cause of his low estate, unquote. That, Stigler wrote, quote, must lead to hatred, and hatred to violence, and violence to the retardation of the mounting compassion and assistance of the white man, unquote. Words fail me, that this is the problem. That white people don't need to be reminded, and if they do, it will retard their mounting compassion and assistance. That white people do not need to be reminded of what other white people, many of them the ancestors of some of them, have done. There is a story that the late singer Johnny Cash is supposed to have told, of him giving a concert at Folsom State Prison in California, notional site of his song Folsom Prison Blues. "Now, Mr. Cash," said the warden, "please don't do anything to remind the convicts they are in a prison," unquote. Jimmy Cash responded, "You mean they've forgotten?" Generally, demonstrations that the oppressed should not remind others of their oppression are either A, demands by oppressors not to have their bad consciences brought to the foreground and not to be reminded of their own bad consciences, or B, demonstrators by the oppressors that they control not just what others do, but what others can say. That telling the truth is itself too revolutionary an act to be tolerated. Stigler went on about how the American Negro, quote, lacks a desire to improve himself, lacks a willingness to discipline himself to this end. The task is to make the Negro discontented with himself. Love of knowledge and the willingness to work hard and achieve it are the product of cultural evolution. The Negro leaders should be helping the emergence of this cultural tradition when instead they are diverting Negro energies from better school buildings to demonstrations. The Negro boy, excluded from many occupations by prejudice, but he's excluded from more by his own inferiority. Lacking education, lacking a tenacity of purpose, lacking a willingness to work hard. The Negro as a neighbor is frequently repelled and avoided by the white man because the Negro family is on average a loose, morally lax group and brings with its presence a rapid rise in crime and vandalism. No statutes, no sermons, no demonstrations will obtain for the Negro the liking and respect that sober virtues command. It is not easy or popular to place the Negro's discontent upon himself, but George Stigler was willing to take on the very difficult burden of saying that black people are lazy and deserve to be discriminated against. Social democracy went against that grain, encouraged people in general to think of themselves as equals. And that, for many, for George Stigler, was a very unfair, indeed an insolent thing for a system to do, and a reason that the system needed to be dismantled. But it is not just race. The idea that workers would expect to have a job. The second part of the right-wing critique was that social democracy was flawed because it led people to expect that there would be full employment and that they could easily get a job. But people should not think, the right-wing critique went, that they had a right to a job or that getting a job would be easy. People needed to be kept on their toes. Social democracy meant both that workers would be insufficiently deferential, that social order would suffer, and that workers would be able to demand too high wages. The government and Federal Reserve thus needed to focus on price stability and then let the unemployment rate go wherever it was go, the Keynesian belief that you should prioritize full employment and then clean up the financing later. That was extraordinarily bad in the long run because it undermined societal worker discipline. Indeed, the line went, government couldn't be a nanny state, offering everybody a bottle when they cried. People needed to cry. Monetary policy needed to be turned over to strongly anti-inflationary policymakers, as Jimmy Carter had already, wittingly or unwittingly, when he turned it over to Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker at the end of 1979. And, in addition to treating Negroes equally, and in addition to treating people who needed to understand the adverse consequences of their bad behavior and how having and keeping a job required was not a right that they had, but instead something that they earned only through their own hard work and discipline. The third flaw was that government had gotten too big and tried to do too many things. Too much of what social democracy attempted was technocratically stupid and unsuccessful. as Reagan's future chief economist Martin Feldstein had put it, as I said before, Martin Feldstein believed to the day he died that it was all the fault of social democracy. That, expansionary policies in the hope of lowering unemployment produced inflation. Retirement benefits were increased without considering the subsequent impact on investment and saving. Regulations were imposed to protect health and safety without evaluating the reduction in productivity. Unemployment benefits would encourage layoffs. Welfare programs to help the poor would weaken family structures, unquote. The perception that there were substantial flaws in the fabric of the social insurance state as implemented in really existing social democracy, that was not wrong. That was not entirely wrong. Why in Britain did social democracy, social democratic education policy, turn out to give children of doctors and lawyers the right to go to Oxford without paying for it? The system was flawed when social democratic industrial policy used the nationalized commanding heights of the economy not to accelerate technological progress and keep employment high, but rather to retard the shift of labor out of sunset industries or to starve investment for tax cuts. Perhaps social democracy might have muddled through, but especially in Britain, union-side wage demands and strikes, especially public sector strikes, pushed the center of the electorate toward thinking union power could be curbed and only the Conservatives would do so. The Volcker disinflation raised unemployment throughout the North Atlantic, and Volcker had been a Jimmy Carter employee. Social democracy could not even commit its own commitment to full employment. The Carter administration attempt to rescue American diplomatic hostages from Iran through a helicopter commando raid failed. The Argentine generals decided they could win popularity by conquering the Falkland Islands from Britain, and Margaret Thatcher responded by winning a splendid little war with Reagan's logistical assistance. Reagan and Thatcher were in power for much of the 1980s as a result, and because they were in power, the neoliberal turn was not aborted, was not a flash, was not an unsuccessful step, but instead became a durable and enduring thing. Now, my friend, the late Galberto Alesina and his co-authors, Nathan Nunn, Laura Giuliano, and many others, see the neoliberal turn as in large part the result of a successful political message aimed at a deep fault line of social democratic society, a fault line that is much deeper in societies that are potentially ethnically divided. A step away from rationality in assessing public programs, and instead focusing on making sure that the taxpayers and the job creators were not being exploited by the moochers and the takers, especially by the moochers and the takers of different race. And the moochers and the takers, they did not really have to be doing the exploiting, simply a fear that they were out there of the wrong ethnicity or with the wrong values or of the wrong religion, that could do the job. And remember, the unworthy being equal, that in itself is mooching and taking in a form of exploitation of the hard workers and the job creators. We did see this in the age of Reagan, that Reagan loved to talk about welfare queens. Here is his principal half-fictional, half-reality-based example. Quote, "She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year." And because Reagan could find one example of a person gaming the system and avoiding fraud charges for a while, because the fraud charges were indeed ultimately brought, single mothers raising young children are not doing valuable social work and do not deserve any form of public help and assistance. The lesson was that no money should be spent on a program that was vulnerable to frauds like this. And the harm done by cutting back social insurance payments to those who were not the fraudsters? No harm was done as long as the cutbacks were applied to programs for those of whom the poor thought undeserving. Cutting back welfare and food stamps, yes. Cutting back veterans' benefits or Social Security or farm subsidies? Unthinkable. And we see this in the age of Trump. I remember one story, quote, Ezekiel Moreno, 35, a Navy veteran, accepted in work advance. That training led him to a job at M&M Manufacturing, which made aerospace parts and to steady pay increases. We've moved out of an apartment and into a house. My daughter is taking violin lessons, and my other daughter has a math tutor. Moreno was sitting at a table with his boss, Ricky Payton. All said that they had voted for Trump, were bewildered that he wanted to cut funds that channel people into good manufacturing jobs. There's a lot of wasteful spending, so cut other places, Moreno said. Payton suggested that if the government wanted to cut budgets, it should target Obama phones provided to low-income Americans. A program that predated President Barack Obama, that was started under George W. Bush and was financed by telecom companies wishing to burnish their reputation as semi-charitable institutions, rather than by taxpayers. The reporter was struck by how loyal all people remained to Trump. Ezekiel Moreno voted for Trump to stick it to the moochers and the liberals. Yet it never occurred to him that Trump, largely because of his Hispanic last name, would view him as one of the chief moochers, would say he's Mexican, and see no difference between a government-funded program that provides him with skilled blue-collar training and the arm-twisting George W. Bush and later on Barack Obama applied to telecom companies to make them offer cell phones on a sliding price scale.